this year's forecast projects that demand could increase by over 30% in the next 10 years, that it could increase by more than 7,000 average megawatts. It is equivalent to meeting the needs of 7 cities the size of Seattle. And we're seeing an incredible need coming from the growth of artificial intelligence.
Welcome back to DAM, the official podcast of Northwest Hydropower. I'm your host, Austin Rohr, and I manage all things communications here at Northwest River Partners. You've probably heard us say over and over again on this podcast that the supply and demand of energy must be perfectly balanced at all times. There are no ifs, ands, or buts in that statement. It simply must be. Meeting that demand is something that happens moment to moment. It happens in the present. But being able to do so, we have to take both short and long-term looks at the future to make sure we have the tools, resources, and preparations necessary well before the moment ever arrives. Now, we've talked about some forecasting from maybe a water supply perspective on the podcast before, but today we're looking at a different forecast, one that holistically considers the future of supply and demand of the Northwest on a broader level. That forecast comes to us from the Pacific Northwest Utilities Conference Committee, often referred to as PNUCC or PNUCC. And joining us from said organization is none other than the executive director herself, Crystal Ball. Crystal, thank you so much for making the time to join us here in person at the Northwest River Partners office and to talk with us about the 2024 Northwest Regional Forecast that you all have produced.
Austin, it's great to be here, especially in person. I really appreciate the invite to share this information with your listeners.
It's really exciting. And something else really exciting that we'll kind of detour off of before we actually get started is you are our first guest in the new podcast studio that we put together. So congratulations. You have the honor of enjoying the new set here.
Yeah, lucky me.
I wish people could see it. Well, they will get to see it because we're going to put up a photo of that at some point. But for everyone else, you'll just have to stay tuned for that. But I think it turned out pretty well.
Yeah, it looks great. And lucky for you if you get an invite to record in studio.
Yes, absolutely. Hopefully we can entice some other folks to come join us. But
yes.
We'll get into the actual conversation that we're supposed to be having here today. And I think the first thing naturally that we try and do with every podcast is starting off with who you are, what your background is, and we also want to know more about the organization that you work for as well. And so we have a lot of organizations in our region in this sort of industry in the Northwest. And so for both public power and for investor-owned utilities and things like that, there's all these acronyms and organizations, and we'd love to know what PNUCC is and what your organization does specifically that makes you stand out.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking and starting with the basics. PNUCC is a trade association, but the thing that makes us different from all of the other and industry trade associations in the region is that we are the trade association that brings together the consumer-owned utilities, public power, and the investor-owned utilities, and some industry partners. So PNUCC is a forum for collaboration, and we bring these groups together, and I am not aware of any other organization in our region that brings these groups together. PNUCC has a long history of collaboration. It's important that we all get together and talk about the opportunities and challenges in our industry. And that's what we do at PNUCC.
And it certainly makes sense. I mean, you would think maybe from an outside perspective, the listeners that we have of this podcast looking in that we would all be just collaborating on a regular basis. But I'm sure you can speak to the fact that isn't necessarily something that takes place, and it is unique to what you all do.
Yes, it is. There's so many things to do, right? And so you have to be intentional about that collaboration. And so it was one of the reasons why I was so interested in working for PNUCC, because we do bring everyone together, and I'm very passionate about that. We have 55 members. And I think when people think of PNUCC, of course, they think public power. There are many of the consumer-owned utilities that are part of PNUCC, but all 6 investor-owned utilities in the 4 Northwest states are also members of PNUCC. And we have a board of directors and a system planning committee. We meet once a month, and it is very educational, and it's an opportunity, again, to bring that group to learn from one another and to really develop regional solutions.
Well, I don't think you need me to tell you, but it's obviously very clearly important work, and we're really excited that there is someone doing that work. And you also mentioned your own personal interests, which kind of leads me to the next question I wanted to ask you, which is, from your own sort of background, I mean, how did you come to be the executive director at the organization?
That's a good question. And I joke that Crystal Ball finally found a job in forecasting. And that is the PNUCC product, this Northwest Regional Forecast. But for people that know me, they know that I do have a passion for bringing people together. I had coffee with Shauna McReynolds, the previous executive director, and when I walked away from that conversation with Shauna, what I realized is that she loved her job. And Shauna hired me to work at PNUCC, and she retired soon after hiring me. It was disappointing not to get to spend a lot of time with Shauna because she's just an incredible person. But it was also, I think, her way of sharing with me and with the board that she felt confident in my leadership of this organization. And so that's how I came to PNUCC. Really, I have a long history of working in this industry, in this region. I worked for the Bonneville Power Administration for 25 years. I started working at BPA when I was 17 years old. And I started working there in the Idaho Falls district office. So I like to tell people that I grew up at BPA. When I left BPA, I was advising BPA executives on energy and environmental policy. I had so many incredible opportunities at BPA, including working in BPA's Washington, D.C. office for about 5 years, doing some really incredible things going on in our industry. We had the West Coast energy crisis at that time, the Energy Policy Act. It was really an exciting place to be and to learn about the industry. And I also got the opportunity to manage the implementation of one of the most comprehensive fish and wildlife mitigation programs. So again, I had a lot of great opportunities to learn about this industry, to build connections, make a network, and that has served me well in this position at PNUCC. And what I get to do at PNUCC is bring people together, and that gives me a regional perspective that I really enjoy sharing with others.
Well, I think that leads right to a question that I think is natural to go to next, and that is to look at that regional perspective, right? Because things are changing quite rapidly. Of course, we'll talk about the forecast, but even just talking about some of your background, the energy crisis that you were there for to experience and things like that. I mean, where we are today is such a rapidly changing environment, and there's a lot going on. And so I'm very curious, having the background that you do both with BPA and now being at PNUCC for these last few years, what changes are you observing when it comes to our region's electric utilities in just the past few years alone in particular?
Well, I like to think of this as increased coordination, significant increase in coordination among all of the utilities in the region and across the western states. And I think of this increased coordination because, the weather is changing, the resource mix is changing, and we just all need to work more together to meet the needs of the people that we serve. And what I think about last year when we issued the 2023 forecast, we emphasized the need to increase coordination, and utilities are really focused on that, especially in the areas of resource adequacy, electricity markets, and transmission planning. And so on resource adequacy, we now have in this region the Western Resource Adequacy Program. And utilities are participants in that program are really working together, focused on the adequacy of the system across the West. The other electricity markets, we already have in the West a real-time electricity market that started in 2014 between PacifiCorp and the California Independent System Operator, and it has grown substantially, and they have added participants in that market over that time. And there are efforts to develop a day-ahead electricity market, and so that's just building on that Western energy imbalance market. Again, increased coordination. And then on transmission planning, we have utilities and stakeholders who were concerned that the way that the West approaches transmission planning isn't getting us to the grid of the future, and so a coalition formed to again increase coordination there, and that coalition is called the Western Transmission Expansion Coalition, referred to as WESTEC. So this is in the last year really some significant things that have come together on increased coordination, really that working together on the RAP, working together to advance the day-ahead electricity market, and then forming a coalition really looking at transmission planning. A lot of work is going on.
It certainly sounds like it, and as we both know, and as many people have probably heard if they're listening to this podcast as a regular listener, it's not exactly something that happens overnight, right? So having all these plans in place and getting going now is obviously an important thing. And with how rapidly things are changing, as we'll be talking about a lot more, the pressure to get some of this stuff going and get it going quickly is obviously of high importance. There's a lot that I'm sure we could talk about that is outside of just this subject or anything that you just discussed. But one thing I did want to clarify, maybe for some of our listeners who are trying to kind of wrap their head around all the different things that you just mentioned, is what is that term day ahead? I mean, what does that mean in terms of moving to a day ahead market? And just and I know it's like that's a huge thing to unpack, but if someone's just curious, like we're switching from one thing to another, what's the difference between those two things? Is there kind of just a quick overview that we could provide so people have a better understanding of that?
I will try to be brief, and I am not an electricity market expert. But I did start with the imbalance market, and that's really within the hour. And so it's a short term. And you started this podcast with it all has to balance every second, or
right.
Yes,
right.
You started that. You said that. And so that real-time market helps utilities keep that balance and gives them access to electricity in a very organized way. The day ahead market really goes from that within hour to a whole day. And giving access to these electricity resources, and they are then dispatched by the market operator. Again, I am not a market expert, but I think it's important to note right now we have access in the within hour, and the day ahead would give us access for a full day.
Right.
This doesn't replace contracting for power on a longer term, because the utilities secure those resources to serve their load, but that load fluctuates. It fluctuates within the hour. It fluctuates, from day to day. It fluctuates from season to season, and this electricity market just gives us a good way of balancing those loads and resources. Hopefully that's a good overview of kind of what we're building from. We're building from that real time to the day ahead. And you could spend a whole episode on electricity markets with someone more informed than me.
Well, as speaking as someone who is a self-proclaimed non-expert to be another self-proclaimed non-expert, trying to reach an audience of many non-experts, I think it's probably a perfect way of describing it. I mean, it makes sense to me, so hopefully it makes sense to the listeners too, right?
Yes. I guess another way to thing to add there, that happens now without an organized market, but it's in a very bilateral way. This would optimize the buying and selling of electricity.
Right. Yeah.
I got there.
That's a perfect elevator pitch way of putting it. Well, I think the next kind of natural question to ask you is really, what is the actual kind of backstory of this Northwest Regional Forecast? When did this all kind of start and come about, and what was the demand for producing this product on an annual basis?
Yeah. Great place to start, because I think a lot of people are aware of PNUCC's Northwest Regional Forecast, but they don't really know that history, and they don't really know how it gets put together. In some form, our region has been forecasting loads and resources over a 10-year or 5-year period for more than 75 years. It all started in 1947 with the Tacoma Conference. And if you think about this region, and if you think about the resource that we heavily rely on, this incredible hydro system, interconnected river system, right? You had to have coordination, and you had to be thinking about what can this system produce, and what is the demand going to be, and what are we going to do together. So really, like I said, PNUCC has a long history of regional collaboration, beginning way back then with the Tacoma Conference, before PNUCC even existed as a trade association. Well, fast forward to the 1980s, and the really big, I think, deal in our region was the passage of the Northwest Power Act in 1980. And PNUCC starts to come together then as a trade association with a big staff that was responsible for participating in the Northwest Power and Conservation's planning processes. And so, there have been a number of executive directors before me, but PNUCC was incorporated in 1986. And Randy Hardy was one of the first executive directors of PNUCC, really that forecast was the product that this association produced. And then times changed, and utilities started doing this, and PNUCC staff went down. And what we do now that we're going to get into is we really work with the utilities who are doing the planning, not PNUCC, and they respond to a request for information, and we put this forecast together. So again, long history, started in 1947. Really, if you think about this region and how interconnected it is, it was something that was needed and is still needed, probably even more than it today.
Right, right. And in terms of, bringing all these different elements together, I mean, as you mentioned, there's plenty of folks out there who are looking at least maybe their own sort of forecast in terms of what they can produce or offer, or what sort of demands they're anticipating coming in their way. But when we look at the actual forecast, which is this holistic approach and taking all these things in, what sort of factors are influencing it? What's being considered, and how do you actually go from taking all these different pieces to reaching a conclusion that's sort of concise and brings all this together?
I have been thinking about the best way to describe this, and I have come up with a puzzle analogy, and there's probably like way better ones, but this is very basic. So as I mentioned, PNUCC staff makes a request to utilities in this region. We request information, and they're used to it. They get it at the end of every year. We make this request for information, and then it's like getting a bunch of, at the end of the year when utilities have responded, it's like getting a big box of pieces. And what PNUCC staff does for the beginning of every year is we dump those pieces out on a table and we start putting it together. And those pieces are, what's your load forecast? What programs do you have, like energy efficiency or demand response? How big do you think those are going to grow? How much energy do you think you are going to save? It's so many pieces. And what we do is we put together a regional picture of the regional power supply. And that has a ton of value because really it has a long history. It's a long-standing resource, and we have tracked the trend year to year. So that's the value of the resource, or the forecast, and that's how it comes together. Each year there is a regional picture of the power system, and we can compare it to what it looked like last year, and we can compare it to what it looked like 10 years ago. Again, this is a forecast, though, of what we think it might look in 10 years.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate the actual kind of puzzle description too, and really painting that picture, because in terms of being on a podcast and trying to like describe all these things, it's such a great visual of dumping the puzzle pieces out and then kind of finding where they all fit together and everything. And I think it'd be very easy to assume when you're looking at something like this, or you're having this conversation set up by the sort of supply and demand example that I was giving and everything.
Yeah.
You could sort of picture that as, here is a supply number, here's a demand number, you subtract one from the other, you get your equation, boom, there's your forecast type of thing. And maybe that is the case at a really base level, but actually determining what is on both of those ends requires a much more complicated equation take place first. And as you mentioned, that includes energy efficiency, it includes demand response. And I know we want to get into what some of those things are as it relates to the forecast.
Yeah.
But I'd be very curious just to hear, again, kind of those maybe high-level descriptions of like, what is energy efficiency? What is demand response? And why is that part of the conversation when we're talking about planning for the future?
Right. And when we're thinking about load or electricity consumption, demand for electricity, those programs reduce that demand. Mm-hmm. And so it's really important that we include what utilities are forecasting for reducing their load. So they'll project their load, they'll think about the programs that then reduce their load. So that's another component of this. If you just think about your load and you don't include how you might reduce it, then you might be planning for more than you need.
Right. And that also gets into something, and it's just something that I think is worth bringing up in this conversation, is I actually had somebody recently ask me, they're like, why are utilities promoting some of these different things? Why do they want people to buy this product or incentivize moving in this direction, making these upgrades to their homes, things like that? And it does play into exactly what we're talking about, which is there's definitely an incentive on the utility end to bring their load down. And if they can do that by promoting some of these different things, then it's worth it to, incentivize it up front.
Right. Because every kilowatt saved is a kilowatt you don't have to generate.
Right.
You don't have to build a new plant to generate that electricity. And we have been very focused on energy efficiency in this region since the 1980s. There are a number of initiatives that started here in the Northwest that have grown across the country on energy efficiency. And it's something that we are known for, again, because every kilowatt saved, you do not have to go look for that kilowatt to be produced. So it's really important in our region, and it helps us conserve what we have. And it really, lowers our cost, too, to consumers.
Right.
Yeah.
And it goes without saying, every kilowatt obviously adds up to a megawatt, and so often we're talking about megawatts on this podcast because we're talking about these great big numbers. But it's the sort of effect of like essentially the little nickels and dimes add up to something greater. So it's important to focus on those individual pieces.
It is important, and when I think about the region working together to save energy and the Northwest Power and Conservation Council that has really promoted energy efficiency because that's what the act required it to do, right? In 40 years, since 1980, the region has saved more than 7,000 average megawatts. Oh, that's a lot when we talk about, like saving a kilowatt, but adding it up over time, over 40 years, that's a lot of power plants that this region did not have to build. That's a lot of carbon emissions that we are not emitting now because of the investments in energy efficiency.
Yeah, it's for folks listening to this podcast, that's a couple dams worth, right?
Yes, 7,000 megawatts is a lot of 7,000 average megawatts is a lot of energy, and we're going to talk about that.
Yes. So moving in that direction, what were the biggest takeaways from the 2024 forecast?
The Northwest regional forecast of loads and resources takes a look at the next 10 years. So it's a forecast of loads and resources for the next 10 years. So the biggest change that we saw was on the demand side, on load. And we saw a continued momentum for the projected surge in demand for electricity. It's really quite remarkable when we compare it to past years. This year's forecast projects that demand could increase by over 30% in the next 10 years, that it could increase by more than 7,000 average megawatts. As we talked, that's a lot. It is equivalent to meeting the needs of 7 cities the size of Seattle. So the load forecast of just the surge in demand for electricity is certainly the first big takeaway. The second takeaway is on the resources side. And so utilities think about their load, and then they think about how they are going to serve that load and what resources they are going to use. What we see is an unprecedented amount of planned future resources. 29,000 megawatts nameplate capacity show up in this year's 10-year outlook of resources. That is an unprecedented amount of generation to build in the next 10 years. So again, we see really 2 big takeaways from our Northwest forecast of loads and resources. The load surge in demand for electricity could grow over 30% in 10 years. And then on the resources side, just an unprecedented amount of new generation in the future.
So that one seems fairly straightforward in terms of describing, what's going on there to our audience. But that first piece, the amount of growth we're anticipating, which you described very nicely as being essentially 7 Seattle's worth of energy. We're not looking at 7 times the size of Seattle being built in the Northwest in terms of population growth. I mean, there's certainly growth taking place, but nothing on that sort of magnitude. What would you say has changed as far as the outlook from previous forecasts to 2024 that's showing such an increase in demand coming online?
Yeah, that's a great question. And another reason why we do the forecast. We are saying that this surge in demand for electricity is attributed to a few things. Data center development, high-tech manufacturing growth, and then that trend towards electrification. That's very different than what we have had in our region in the past. In fact, in 2022, when I worked with Shauna on my first regional forecast, we weren't really seeing much of a change in the demand for electricity. And then in 2023, when my colleague Eliza Seelig and I worked on this together, we were seeing a really big change. And it was because utilities were becoming more certain about really big new loads with the data center development. And that's not happening just in our region. If you think of Virginia and Texas, their demand for electricity from the data center development dwarfs what we are experiencing here in the Northwest. So the companies developing the data centers really see some advantages for developing those data centers here in our region. And they are getting bigger than they have been before because of the need. And we're seeing an incredible need coming from the growth of artificial intelligence.
Well, that is something too that I would definitely sort of amplify and maybe build on top of is I think back to an example of probably about 10 years ago now, going to visit a friend who lived in Bend, Oregon at the time. Mm-hmm. And the big talk of the town was that the Facebook server was coming in. And so all the construction was going on. There were all these people who were hired to build it and maintain it and do all these different things. And that was all, there's been to some degree something that you could describe under the umbrella of AI, but just in the last few years alone, it's completely exploded.
Yes.
And so the nature of what these data centers do and what they are is very different from what it has been.
Yes.
And I think, neither of us are data center experts. We're not AI experts. We're coming at this from an energy perspective. But I think it's worth pointing out that as far as the landscape of what these data centers not only do, but also what they need is so incredibly different. And, as we're seeing, it's a rapid change, right? I mean, as fast as I can ask my phone to do certain things, or, this new one that I've gotten now, I can completely remove people from photos using AI.
Oh, wow.
I can actually, another very interesting feature is, if I took a picture and it was crooked and I wanted to straighten it, I can tilt it back to straight, and instead of having to crop parts of the image to accomplish that, it will just fill in the missing pieces with AI. And it's so good at doing it that you can't even, I've experimented with it, right? It's like you can't even tell.
Yeah.
But something that you and I discussed this morning, actually, before we even recorded, was every time that I do that, or anyone listening does that, we are having an impact on our energy demand and on the amount of load that is being applied to the grid through these data centers.
Right. It's a surge in demand for electricity that we just haven't seen. And you started with the data center in Central Oregon for Facebook, and that's cloud storage. And the data centers that we are seeing being developed now are for different reasons, and it is something that we use in our everyday life. When you think about it, we have our phones, and we ask we ask this computer in our pocket to do so many things, but it's also like how our economy runs too. And it's the security of our financial system, and so there's so much more. And I am curious about this development and the electricity need to really accommodate these developments. I've heard it described this year as an insatiable demand for electricity. And so I have a lot more to learn. I'm very curious about what it takes, but it's certainly driving a surge in demand for electricity that those of us working in this industry right now may have never have seen before. If you go back to the 70s, there was projections in an incredible demand for electricity, and we did different things back then. This is different. This is an industry that's going to need a lot of electricity to keep it powering, and it's going to really impact our economy. So we need to keep up with it. We need to be curious about it. And I know that utilities who are working with the companies developing these data centers are learning as fast as they can, and certainly building as fast as they can. There's a lot more coordination too around that with these really big buyers of electricity coordinating more with utilities. So there's a whole lot more to do, but it is the number one big change, I think, in our industry. But then on the resources side,
Right.
Yes. We have a changing resource mix.
Yes, definitely.
Yes.
I would also, to just quickly say, and I know that it's something that we're probably way in advance of ever getting to this point, but it does start to feel like maybe the conversation that we're already having with energy efficiency right now could potentially shift in terms of, in the past, maybe we tell people to turn the lights off when they leave the house, or we ask them to upgrade certain appliances or household items that can be more efficient. And now we might be asking them, hey, don't ask AI to do everything. Maybe try writing that assignment without.
I don't know. It's gonna make our life more. I wish I could predict the future.
Right.
But it's really gonna be transformational, and I think that this technology has the potential to make things a lot better, and to we can use this technology in our industry to collect a lot more data, and we can process that data so much faster, right? And that can make us more efficient as an industry. There's so much to learn about this technology and what it can do to make our lives better.
When it comes to some of the other differences and trends from, say, 2 years ago to now, I mean, what are we looking at just as far as, we have these big overarching discussions about the load growth and about the sort of, circumstances of meeting these clean energy mandates and bringing new resources online, taking others off. But there's other things certainly that I'm sure are factoring into this as well, that are creating this sort of different picture right now than what we've seen in years past.
Yes. I mentioned the trend in electrification. And so what I mean by that is transitioning to electricity for transportation. So the increasing demand from electric vehicles, and also as we think about generating electricity with cleaner resources, and then also, meeting our energy needs with cleaner resources. That could transition load from heating your home with natural gas to heating your home with electricity now. So that's driving an increase in demand for electricity.
And then in terms of the outlook for building this new generation to meet that demand, where are we at as a region? I mean, we've talked about already that these things don't happen overnight. So when it comes to predicting how much we can build, how much we need to build, and when we expect it to actually be available, where are we at right now?
There is a great transformation happening in the electric utility industry, and we are seeing an increase in generation coming from wind and solar. And you can drive around this region and you can see more solar and you can see more wind power, and so that is a big transformation happening. These resources are getting built. There are challenges in building these resources. It's one thing to develop these resources in areas where there's wind and sunshine. It's another thing to build the energy infrastructure to get the power from where it's produced to where it is consumed. When we looked at the data, we really wanted to emphasize this need for upgrading the region's electricity infrastructure. That includes the generation and the transmission infrastructure, those high voltage lines that get the power from where it's produced to where it's needed. So again, building the generation is one thing, getting that generation to where it's consumed is a whole other thing.
And there's also that conversation around the intermittency of those resources of wind and solar not being able to produce energy on demand, on notice when we need it.
That's right.
Which obviously brings up the storage question as well of where do we store that energy so that we can then access it when it's actually needed, not just when it's being generated.
That's right. And if you think about the advancements in storage, in energy storage, it makes me think of what's going on in California on their battery storage, because they have a lot of new renewable resources, especially solar, and the storage capability in California has grown exponentially in just a few short years. Here in the Northwest, we're different because we have these peak needs that are prolonged, that happen in winter when there isn't a whole lot of solar around. The hydropower system is a dependable resource that has the ability to store a lot of water that can be used to produce power behind those large reservoirs. It's also a very flexible resource and has allowed this region to integrate a lot of those intermittent resources because we've been able to store water when those intermittent resources are available, and then when they're not, we can release water from the hydropower system. So it's been a very symbiotic kind of relationship, but as utilities develop more wind and solar, we are seeing utilities add battery storage and other energy storage resources to the resource mix.
Along those same lines, there have been conversations, there's always been conversations of this nature, but there's been conversations that have taken place around the idea of removing dams. And we won't have those conversations here on the podcast today, but those conversations have unearthed the understanding through studies and different processes that in order to replace really any firm resources, which would also be those carbon emitting resources we're looking to retire, that you have to build more intermittent resources with storage capabilities than, in terms of the actual, capability, than what currently is there.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to use numbers that are actually accurate here. This is purely for example's sake, but say you had 5,000 megawatts of a firm resource, you build 10,000 megawatts of an intermittent resource. And again, those are not, it's not exactly like that. It's not even close to a fair assumption to make. But for context's sake, that's sort of what we're talking about here, is having to build more than what you're replacing. Is that something you also see when you're looking at the forecast and looking at this build out that we're predicting we're going to need to make?
Yeah, well, if you think about it, the projected demand, right, that I talked about is over 7,000 average megawatts. And then we see on the resources side a projection of 29,000 megawatts of planned future resources. It kind of helps you make the point you're talking about, Austin. These nameplate resources is one way to think about the power that can be produced from these resources, because that's what they are built to be able to do, but they don't always produce what they're able to, and sometimes that's a fuel supply issue, sometimes that's an operational decision, right? And so this unprecedented amount of resources is to me a projection of about 7,000 average megawatts. And you have to have a diversity of resources to meet that demand, because these resources don't always produce how much they are capable of. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that's like helping you make that point. You really have to have more resources than what your demand might be, because you have to have that diverse resources, and you have to have the dependability, right? That these resources are going to show up when you need them. And I think that's what makes our region very unique, is because we have this very large, dependable hydropower system. It is produced by a river that runs down a very steep hill. And the river has been developed here in the region for the public good, and it produces a lot of hydropower. When we look at the total of all of the nameplate capacity resources in our region, by far, hydro out measures them all. 61% of the total nameplate is from hydropower. And again, it gives this region an economic and environmental advantage that the rest of the country really envies, because this is low cost, clean hydropower, and it is really what makes our region unique, and it is very dependable. And the resources that we are building now have very different characteristics, I would say. But it's all built to work together.
In terms of the challenges that we're now facing with our region, we've talked about the build out, we've talked about the increasing demand, the data centers, everything like that. But are there other additional challenges, maybe something, akin to what we're seeing with climate change, more extreme weather, things of that nature, that are further complicating the issue of meeting that demand and making this sort of, 30% increase something that we can actually keep up with?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it makes me think of what happened at the beginning of this year in January with that extreme weather and the cold snap that happened in the Pacific Northwest. So utilities are focused on resource adequacy. They are focused on resource adequacy because of the changing weather, and we have experience more extreme weather. We have we experience extreme weather more frequently than we have had in the past. And those cold snaps drive up demand, and utilities need to plan for meeting that peak demand. At the same time, we are in this region transitioning to cleaner resources. And so resources have been retired. Coal plants here in this region have shut down. And we are replacing the power that was produced by those resources. So we have this dual challenge, right, of meeting this peak demand and transitioning to cleaner energy resources. So utilities really are focused on resource adequacy. And that January event demonstrated how dangerously close the region came to not being able to meet the demand. And this region relied on 5,000 megawatts of imports from outside the region to meet that demand. So this is something that is significant, and it's one of the reasons why this region worked together to put together that resource adequacy program. So when I say utilities are really focused on resource adequacy, they are doing a number of things, like assessing whether we will be able to build enough new generation, not only to replace what has retired, but to meet this projected surge in demand. And that's really challenging. So
we have a lot of challenges, to say the least. We've talked so much about those challenges
That's great.
as
That's
well.
great.
And I really appreciate being able to properly convey that to our audience and describe that. Looking at the other side of that, are there any clear solutions? And the obvious one, I'm sure, that comes to mind for people is just build the resources, right?
Yes.
Just build the resources, upgrade the transmission, boom, we're there. But
Yes.
we know that's not how things work. So are there any clear solutions? And if so, what would those be?
Yes, there are so many opportunities to really focus on solutions. Let's just say there's so much going on in this industry, right? And so much opportunity that it's really what makes me excited about working in this industry right now. So really looking for those opportunities. And you said it, let's build the resources, let's build the transmission, let's increase coordination so that we're using what we have more efficiently. I mentioned resource adequacy, and utilities are looking at extending the life of existing resources, so converting coal plants to natural gas plants. Natural gas is not as carbon intensive as coal, and so that is a opportunity to transition to cleaner resources, right? But then we talked about batteries, and there's I think opportunity in long duration energy storage, and we see utilities investing in some demonstration projects because this region, like I said, is prone to prolonged peak demand, and so we need storage that is longer than what's commercially available, than what is working in California, because we have peak in the winter and it's cold and there's not a whole lot of sun, so we need longer duration storage. And then there's advanced technologies, and we see, the U.S. Department of Energy putting funding behind hydrogen, behind advanced nuclear technologies. And those things don't show up in the Northwest Regional Forecast yet, but they could profoundly change the region's energy landscape.
I really appreciate that, and getting that insight into, kind of what we can look forward to. Along those same lines, something that just really came to mind for me now that I'd love to get your take on is, as far as next year's forecast, right? Looking at 2025 and what the Northwest Regional Forecast might look like then, is there anything that right off the top of your head you would hope to see maybe next year, transitioning from this year where we're at, where things look a little bit scary, to, what would make next year's forecast help us all breathe a sigh of relief?
Oh my gosh. If only I could predict the future. Like I said, the value in the forecast is that it tracks the changes from year to year. I don't know what we will see, but I anticipate that there will likely be more demand for electricity. Because I think that we are not capturing the potential data center, all of the potential data center development in the region. So there's one thing. We saw a big change between 22 and 24 in planned future resources. And like I just mentioned, some of those new technologies aren't yet showing up in the forecast. We'll start to see that. I did mention advanced nuclear, and Energy Northwest is a member of PNUCC. And so I want to certainly recognize the work that Energy Northwest is doing, and they are doing it with public power support. I know that Puget Sound Energy has committed funding to the feasibility study of Energy Northwest pursuing, advanced nuclear technology with X Energy. The state of Washington is also supporting the feasibility study. So there's a lot of different technologies that we could see showing up in the forecast in future years. I don't know if it'll happen next year, but again, the value is tracking the trend over time. Right. And I just anticipate, seeing continued increase in demand from all of the things, data center development, high tech manufacturing growth in this region, right? This is where some things get made, and some things in high tech get made here in this region. It's a big employer. Intel is a big employer in Oregon, Microsoft in Washington, and there's a lot of support for building more of that technology here in this country, and it's going to happen here in this region as well as other parts. So the trend for electrification too. There is an opportunity to decarbonize the energy sector by transitioning the transportation system to electric vehicles. We will see that probably in small passenger vehicles, but fleets of vehicles. That's what will drive huge increases in electricity. So I anticipate that we will continue to see projections of increased demand, and then we'll see probably these new technologies showing up in future years of the forecast.
Well, we certainly hope so, because we're gonna need everything we can get. It's certainly going to be all hands on deck. As far as kind of wrapping things up here, we're getting to the end, and I really want to ask you, what is the message you'd like our listeners to take away from this podcast? What can we sort of give them, whether it's maybe a bit of a heads up, or whether it's something they need to get out there and do, or if they should feel maybe confident in where we're at and where we're going.
Yeah. I think I said it before, but I'll come back to it. Really, the data from this year's forecast makes us want to emphasize this tremendous and urgent need for increasing the region's electricity infrastructure. Utilities are planning on this unprecedented amount of new generation in the next 10 years. And really, if people only remember two things from our long conversation, Austin, I hope it's this, that it's going to take intense, coordinated planning and strong public support to assure an affordable, reliable, and adequate power supply during the region's transition to cleaner energy future.
And lastly, I think the thing I'd like to kind of round us out on, where can people go to learn more? I mean, if they want to know more about the subject, about the predictions for the future, where can they do that? And along those lines too, is there something that they could go do right now potentially to be helpful in this circumstance, so they don't feel like they're just kind of sitting back and hearing this and wondering who or what's going to save the day when it comes to meeting this new demand?
Well, we think the forecast is very valuable. We are really trying to make people more aware of it. So we are building awareness, and by that, we hope that we build better understanding. And so we post the Northwest Regional Forecast on PNUCC's website at pnucc.org. And you can see a long history of the region's forecast of loads and resources. But in general, I think really people should be curious about where this demand is coming from, curious about what we can do as a region to meet this need. I think just being better educated and aware of what's going on.
Is it also fair to say too, and I only ask because I so often tell people this just in my sort of day-to-day work when I'm out in the public and interacting with folks, that they should lean more into their utility, whether it's an investor-owned utility or a public utility, lean in more on that and see what potentially programs they have when it comes to again, those incentives we talked about, those things that help energy efficiency. I mean, should we just kind of push people in that direction and say, go talk with those folks?
I think so. Have a relationship with your utility. Again, understand what's going on, because I do think that you can have a big individual impact because as we talked, every kilowatt saved, right, adds up to a whole lot, and that will make a big impact. So being aware of your energy use, knowing where it comes from, and really being curious about what is going on around you. So I come back to that, and you're right that we all get our electricity from an organization, whether it's an investor-owned utility or public power, and get involved. There's lots of ways to get involved in this incredible industry at this really dynamic time.
I appreciate that. Thank you. We've reached the sort of conclusion of the conversation today, and I really appreciate the time and all of your incredible insights into this topic. And I believe you did mention listening to at least one or two episodes of the podcast in advance, so you may be prepared for where I'm taking things next. But as always, as our listeners know, we love to close out the podcast by coming back to our guest, getting to know you a little bit better and what makes you you. So the way we do that is always to ask people if they have any advice they could share with our listeners, something that's important to you in your everyday life or your career, or anything else that maybe has stood out to you recently that you just love to pass on to other folks. So with that, I'll put you on the spot and give you the chance to open up and share what piece of advice you have.
I love how you wrap it up. And really how you start with getting to know the person that you invite to be on this podcast, and then closing it with this piece of advice. I've said it a number of times, be curious, and for me, not judgmental, because I think of all the times when I rushed to judgment and have closed off my ability to be curious about something, to learn more about something, to learn more about someone's perspective. So my piece of advice is certainly be curious, not judgmental. But I have many, and it was hard to pick just one.
Understandable.
Because there's something that stuck with me a long time ago, and it came from a young adult book that I read with my children. And it was based on a book called Wonder and Mr. Brown's Precepts. And one of Mr. Brown's precepts from that book is when given the choice when given the choice between being right and kind, choose kind. And I think this is really important for collaboration and bringing people together, especially a diverse group of people. And it's really important, again, to hear those diverse perspectives to listen and to be kind so that people feel comfortable sharing those diverse perspectives. So my two are be curious and be kind.
Well, I will say I hope that we satisfied some curiosity today with our discussion. I think it's really been great, and I appreciate the advice so much. I think it's a fantastic message to lead people on, and I also think it's worth pointing out that as you shared at the beginning of this podcast, PNUCC's in a unique position, bringing together these regional electric utilities that are both on the investor and consumer-owned side of things, and so. It's great that they have leadership who is able to bring that kindness in there and not have any of these guys beating up on each other and things like that, and being able to get everybody to collaborate in this really unique way. So really appreciate it. And again, thank you so much for making the time for the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. It's been great to share my regional perspective with you, Austin.
When the 2024 Northwest Regional Forecast arrived from PNUCC, it definitely caught some attention. I can't thank Crystal enough for taking the time on today's podcast to discuss what it does and, equally important, does not mean for our clean energy future. It's clear that we've got some work to do and some challenges ahead, but that doesn't mean we have to panic. We should, however, face this challenge head on and make sure we're making the most of every ounce of hydropower available to us while we do it. Now, if you want to join the fight for hydropower, head on over to nwriverpartners.org and check out our website. You can even utilize our contact form to let us know what you think of the podcast and who or what you'd like to hear next. You can also share your comments, questions, and concerns there. And if that's too complicated, just email us directly at info@nwriverpartners.org. You can also help out the podcast specifically by hopping on to the listening platform you're on right now and subscribing to keep up with future episodes. While you're there, we'd love a 5-star review to boost our ranking and help the podcast grow. Then turn on notifications so you're alerted to new uploads, which arrive every other Friday. Lastly, be sure to follow us at NW River Partners on Facebook, Instagram, X, YouTube, and LinkedIn. We've got another exciting episode coming up next that ties into some of what our friends are doing to actually help address the challenges that we talked about today. So stay tuned for that. And until next time, see ya.